"Great costume, Oldman," a man chuckled as the old veteran walked into the courtroom. Guffaws rang out in the room, jeering at his frayed uniform, rusted metals, and labored stride. No one said a word, but when the judge opened up the file and read the last name, she arose, and her subsequent move quieted the whole courtroom. If you think that dignity should precede judgment, click Honor below. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Walter Dean, 82 years old, stood outside the courtroom door, gathering his strength. His arthritic hands gripped his walking cane, a necessity. Since his second hip replacement 3 years ago, he straightened his back as much as his aging spine would allow. A habit formed through years of military discipline, today was important after being arrested for disturbing the public peace while protesting the removal of the local Veterans Memorial. He had decided to face the charges with dignity that meant wearing his old Army uniform, the same one he had worn during his service in Vietnam, from 1967 to 1972. The uniform hung loosely on his thin frame. Now the green fabric had faded over the decade, and the creases were permanently set from years of careful storage. His sergeant stripes and campaign ribbons, though dulled with age, remained meticulously arranged on his chest. Walter had polished his medals last night, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and others, though the tarnish had become too stubborn to fully remove. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy courtroom door. The conversation inside immediately dimmed as heads turned toward him. Walter moved slowly down the center aisle, the rubber tip of his cane making a soft tapping sound with each labored step. "Look at that," a young man in the back row whispered loudly to his friend. "Nice costume, old man." The comment sparked scattered laughter. Walter kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged. Though the mockery stung more than he would admit. "Bet he bought those medals on eBay," someone else said, not bothering to lower their voice. A group of young professionals in the jury box, representatives from the city's development office who had pushed for removing the memorial, exchanged amused glances. One of them mimed, saluted, triggering more snickers. As Walter approached the defendant's table, a young security guard stepped into his path. "Sir," the guard said, barely concealing his skepticism, "are you sure you're wearing the appropriate attire for court?" Walter didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced his veteran's ID card. The plastic was worn, the photo faded, the text barely legible after years of being carried in his wallet. The guard examined it with visible doubt, before reluctantly stepping aside from the plaintiff's table. The city attorney, a polished woman in her 40s, with an expensive suit and carefully styled hair, watched with poorly disguised contempt. She leaned toward her assistant and whispered something that made them both smile. Walter took his seat at the defendant's table alone. He had been unable to afford a lawyer, and the court-appointed public defender had met with him only briefly before today. The young attorney had seemed distracted and uninterested, clearly viewing Walter's case as a lost cause. As he waited for proceedings to begin, Walter could feel the stares and hear the whispered joke. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of containing emotions that had been building since they announced the memorial's removal 3 months ago. That memorial had been his last connection to the men he'd served with, the men who hadn't made it home. The city had called it outdated and an obstruction to the park's modernization plan when Walter had staged his one-man protest, chaining himself to the monument. They'd arrested him for causing a public disturbance now as he sat in his faded uniform, waiting for judgment. Walter wondered if anyone in this room could possibly understand what that memorial meant, or what the uniform he wore had cost him. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Clara Monroe entered, and everyone rose, everyone, except Walter, whose arthritic knees made quick movements impossible. This earned him more disapproving glances, though no one offered to help. Case number 47. 329, City of Riverdale versus Walter Dean. The bailiff announced charges disturbing the public peace and resisting arrest. The city attorney stood smoothing her tailored jacket. "Your Honor, the facts in this case are straightforward. On April 15th, the defendant created a public disturbance at Memorial Park by chaining himself to a monument scheduled for legal removal. When police attempted to remove him, he resisted, requiring officers to forcibly cut the chain." She gestured dramatically toward Walter. "The defendant has a history of disrupting community events when they don't align with his personal views. While we respect the elderly, we cannot allow disruptive behavior to damage our community's image, especially as we prepare for the summer tourism season with our park renovation. Walter's court-appointed attorney, a young man named David Collins, looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing at his watch and shuffling papers, clearly unprepared. The judge looked at him. "Counselor, your response." David cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client." Judge Monroe nodded, and David practically pulled Walter into a side room. "Mr. Dean," he said, in a hushed, exasperated tone, "you didn't tell me you were going to wear a military uniform to court. This isn't helping your case." "It's my uniform," Walter said quietly. "I earned it." "Look," David sighed, "the evidence against you is solid. They have photos, video footage, and police testimony. The best strategy is to apologize, pledge not to do it again, and hope for community service instead of a fine you can't afford." Walter looked at him steadily. "I won't apologize for defending a memorial to my fallen brothers then. I don't know how to help you," David said, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going to ask the court if I can withdraw from the case." Walter nodded slowly. "Do what you need to do, son." Back in the courtroom, David approached the bench. "Your Honor, due to irreconcilable differences in case strategy, I request permission to withdraw as counsel." The judge frowned but granted the request. After a brief questioning, Walter was now without representation. As Walter returned to his table alone, the whispers in the courtroom grew louder. "Probably one of those guys who pretends to be a veteran for free meals." "Someone said my uncle served in Vietnam, and he never makes a scene like this," said another. The city attorney smiled slightly. Sensing an easy victory, Walter said nothing instead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded piece of olive drab fabric. He placed it carefully on the table in front of him. Hand-stitched into the cloth were the words, "Charlie Co., 3rd Battalion, 1969. The piece of fabric, a remnant of a field bandage that had once saved a man's life, meant nothing to those watching. Some people in the gallery even laughed, assuming it was another pathetic attempt to gain sympathy. A young man in the back row held up his phone, clearly recording, waiting for an entertaining moment to capture for social media. No one stood for Walter. No one recognized what that faded piece of cloth represented. No one seemed to care that the old man sitting alone at the defendant's table had once put his life on the line for the very freedom that now allowed them to mock him. The city attorney approached the bench with a stack of exhibits, photographs of Walter chained to the memorial, police reports, and plans for the renovated park that would replace the outdated monument. "Your Honor," she said confidently, "the city requests that Mr. Dean be fined the maximum amount for his disruption and be required to make a public apology. We also ask for a restraining order preventing him from entering the park during renovation." She displayed a large before and after rendering of the park. The before image showed the current memorial, a simple stone structure, with names etched into its surface, portrayed in dull colors and unflattering angles. The after image showed smiling families enjoying a bright, modern space, with no visible acknowledgement of those who had served. "Progress requires change," she concluded, "and sometimes we must respectfully move forward from the past." Walter sat silently, his gnarled hands resting on the table beside the faded fabric, his eyes fixed on a distant point only he could see in his mind. He wasn't in a courtroom, but back in the steaming jungles, carrying wounded comrades through hostile territory, promising them they wouldn't be forgotten, a promise he was now failing to keep. They questioned his honor. They laughed at his silence. "If you think some uniforms should never be mocked, type : respect below." Judge Clara Monroe, 58, had been presiding over the county court for nearly 15 years. Known for her efficiency and no-nonsense approach, she usually moved through the daily docket with practiced precision, but something about this case made her pause. She glanced down at the file before her, flipping methodically through the police reports and city ordinances. But when she reached the final page, the defendant's personal information, her hand suddenly stilled. "Walter Dean, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Charlie, Company 3rd Battalion, 25th Infantry Division." Clara's eyes lingered on those details, her normally composed expression shifting almost imperceptibly. She looked up, studying the elderly man at the defendant's table with new intensity. The courtroom continued its low murmur of conversation, oblivious to the transformation happening behind the bench. Judge Monroe's mind was racing back through decades to childhood photos and stories, told in hushed, reverent tone. "Mr. Dean," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom chatter. "May I ask you a question?" Walter looked up, surprised to be addressed directly by the judge. He nodded. "Did you participate in Operation Harvest Wind in 1969? The question hung in the air. The city attorney looked confused by this unexpected detour in the proceedings. Walter's roomy eyes widened slightly. He sat up straighter, the military bearing returning to his posture. Despite his age, "Yes, Your Honor. I did. You were with Charlie Company during that operation." "Yes, ma'am. I was squad leader." Walter's voice was quiet but clear. "I don't usually bring it up. Nobody ever asked." Clara Monroe's hands trembled slightly as she closed the case file. The courtroom had fallen silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere without, understanding its cause. "My father was Captain James Monroe," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He was Charlie Company's commanding officer." Walter's face transformed with recognition. "Captain Monroe," he repeated softly. "He was a good man, a fine officer. He never came home from that operation." Judge Monroe said I was 2 years old. The silence in the courtroom deepened. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the easy victory she had anticipated was slipping away. With deliberate movements, Judge Clara Monroe stood up from her chair. Then, in a gesture that shocked the entire courtroom, she raised her right hand in a formal military salute, directed at Walter Dean. A phone clattered to the floor as someone dropped it in surprise. The smirks and whispers were replaced by confused looks and uncertain glances. "Your Honor," the city attorney began. "I'm not sure." Judge Monroe cut her off with a raised hand. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her voice leaving no room for argument as the judge exited the courtroom. The tension remained. Walter sat motionless, his weathered face showing the first emotion since he had entered a complex mixture of pride, sorrow, and remembrance. Just as the bailiff was preparing to lead Walter to a waiting area, movement came from the back of the courtroom. An elderly man with a metal cane rose shakily to his feet. "I need to speak," he said, his voice cracking with age, but carrying the unmistakable tone of urgency. "I need to be heard about." "Walter Dean." The bailiff hesitated, then nodded, allowing the man to approach. He moved slowly to the front of the courtroom, each step deliberate and difficult. "My name is Frank Garrison," he said, addressing the now silent gallery. "I served with Walter in '69. I just came to watch today. Didn't think I'd need to speak." He turned to face Walter, their eyes meeting across decades of shared experience. "That man," Frank said, pointing a trembling finger at Walter, "pulled me out of a rice paddy under heavy fire. After I took shrapnel in both legs, carried me over a mile to the extraction point. The medic said I had less than an hour before I would have bled out." Frank's voice broke. "If it wasn't for Sergeant Dean, wouldn't have come home, wouldn't have met my wife, wouldn't have had my children or grandchildren." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded, creased photograph showing 2 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a helicopter. "That's us day before the operation." Walter never talked about what he did, never sought recognition. But I remember, as Frank finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent. The mockery that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy, respectful quiet. Even the city attorney looked shaken, her confident demeanor crumbling as she realized she had been ridiculing a legitimate hero. When Judge Monroe returned to the bench, her expression was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She carried a folder that hadn't been there before. "This court will now resume," she said, "and I believe we have some facts to clarify." She began to read from the folder. "Sergeant Walter Dean awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action on June 17, 1969 during Operation Harvest Wind. Then Corporal Dean's platoon came under intense enemy fire with complete disregard for his own safety. Corporal Dean crossed exposed terrain multiple times to rescue wounded comrades." The judge continued reading from Walter's military record, detailing acts of bravery that the man himself had never mentioned. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. What had begun as mockery had become something approaching reverence. "Captain Monroe's last field report," Judge Monroe said, her voice softening, "specifically mentioned Sergeant Dean's extraordinary courage under fire and recommended him for commendation. My father wrote those words the day before he was killed in action." She looked directly at Walter, their connection now visible to everyone. "My mother told me stories about my father's brave men. I never thought I'd meet one of them in my own courtroom." Walter sat very still, the memories of those distant days clearly playing across his lined face. For a moment, it seemed the ghosts of fallen comrades filled the room, young men forever frozen in time, watching this unexpected reunion across the decades. "I remember your father speaking of you," Walter said softly. "He carried your photo, showed it to us during the rain delays, said, You had your mother's eyes at this deeply personal detail. Judge Monroe's careful composure faltered briefly. A single tear tracked down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. The city attorney sat silently, all arguments forgotten. The spectators who had laughed earlier now looked ashamed. In the span of minutes, an old man in a costume had been revealed as something else entirely. A hero who had walked among them, unrecognized Judge Monroe, looked directly at Walter Sergeant Dean. Having reviewed your military record during our recess and heard the testimony offered here today, I find that the context of your actions has been severely misrepresented. She held up the folder. This record is a matter of public record, though one that clearly hasn't been properly acknowledged until now. She continued reading. Sergeant Walter Dean awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action on June 17, 1969 during Operation Harvest Wind. Then Corporal Dean's platoon came under intense enemy fire with complete disregard for his own safety. Corporal Dean crossed exposed terrain multiple times to rescue wounded comrades. Despite sustaining injuries himself, he continued to coordinate defense and evacuation, directly saving the lives of 7 men. The courtroom was absolutely still. The city attorney stared at her note, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. Judge Monroe continued. Sergeant Dean also received the Bronze Star with Valor Device 2, Purple Hearts, and numerous commendation medals during his 5 years of service in Vietnam. She set down the file and addressed the court. In light of these facts and the testimony we've heard, this court dismisses all charges against Sergeant Walter Dean. She struck her gavel firmly. Moreover, I am issuing a judicial recommendation to the City Council that the Veterans Memorial in question be preserved as a historical landmark, protected from future development plans. Walter sat very still, his hands folded atop his cane, his expression betraying little of what he felt, but those closest to him could see the slight trembling of his shoulders. The judge wasn't finished. Sergeant Dean has demonstrated the same courage in standing up for his fallen comrades today that he showed on the battlefield 56 years ago. This court recognizes his service and his sacrifice. Clara Monroe's voice softened, and on a personal note, I thank you, Sergeant, for serving alongside my father, for being there on a day I've only heard about through letters and second-hand stories. You've given me a connection to him. I never expected to find. The city attorney rose hesitantly. Your Honor, the city wishes to withdraw all complaints against Mr. Dean, and she paused, looking genuinely remorseful. I personally apologize for my conduct and statements today. As the reality of what was happening spread through the courtroom, the atmosphere transformed. The young man who had mocked Walter's costume approached him tentatively. Sir, he said, his face flushed with shame. I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I was completely out of line. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Honor doesn't require apologies, son, but I appreciate you coming back. The young man swallowed hard and shook. Walter's hand visibly moved by the gracious response. As the courtroom began to clear, a boy about 10 years old cautiously approached. Walter, he clutched a small notebook in his hands. Mr. Dean, he said hesitantly, my grandpa was in Vietnam too. He collects veteran signatures. Would you sign your name for him? Walter took the notebook with tender care, as if receiving a precious gift. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name, not from age but from emotion. What's your grandpa's name, son? He asked. Robert Jenkins, the boy replied. He was a radio operator. Walter nodded, adding something extra beneath his signature. Before returning the notebook, tell him, Whiskey 6 says hello. The boy's face lit up with excitement as he realized Walter had used his grandfather's radio call sign outside the courthouse. A reporter from the local newspaper approached Walter. Sergeant Dean, can I ask you a few questions about today's ruling? Walter agreed, speaking quietly but clearly about the importance of remembering those who served the next morning. The paper ran a front-page story with the headline, Unnamed Hero Finally Remembered. Court Vindicates Vietnam Veteran Within Days. The story had spread beyond the local community. Veterans groups from across the state expressed support for Walter and the memorial. The city council, responding to mounting public pressure, passed an emergency resolution to preserve the Veterans Monument, renaming it the Sergeant Walter Dean Veterans Memorial at the rededication ceremony. The following month, Walter stood tall despite his physical pain. Hundreds of community members attended, including many who had been in the courtroom that day. Judge Monroe was there too, not in her judicial robes, but wearing a dress uniform pin that had belonged to her father. As Walter cut the ribbon on the newly protected memorial, he placed a singles rose at its base not for himself, but for the men from his unit who never returned home, for Captain Monroe, for all those whose sacrifices had almost been forgotten in that moment, surrounded by a community that had finally recognized his worth. Walter Dean found a peace he had been seeking for over 50 years. Not everyone who wears a uniform demands recognition, but there are those who, just by having their name spoken aloud, make an entire society bow its head. Walter Dean never sought acclaim. He simply wanted his fallen comrades to be remembered in defending their memorial. He finally received the acknowledgement he never asked for himself, not as a costume-wearing old man causing trouble, but as a hero who had given parts of himself that could never be reclaimed. His story reminds us that honor isn't always visible at first glance, that the quietest among us may carry the heaviest burdens of sacrifice, that sometimes those we dismiss most easily are the very ones who have given the most. He didn't need applause, he only needed to be treated as someone who had truly sacrificed. Have you ever seen someone misjudged because they didn't look like a hero? Share that story below. Subscribe to Deep Story Dispatch, where honor is never forgotten.